Welcome to the National Cannabis Prevention and Information Centre. My name is Kate and I am a Research Officer here in the Clinical Training team, and I'll be introducing you to today's presenter. I'll also be moderating the question time at the end of the presentation, so please type through any questions you would like answered by the presenter and I'll do my best to make sure these are addressed. This webinar will focus on a very brief intervention which consists of a screening, assessing, feedback and education components. This webinar series will be delivered by Etty Matalon. Etty is the Clinical Training Manager here at NICPIC and has over 26 years experience working as a psychologist in the alcohol and other drugs field. She has been disseminating clinical workshops for NICPIC since we started in 2007. So Etty, I'll hand it over to you.
Right, thank you very much, Kate. Welcome everyone, and apologies for cancelling, I think, Tuesday's webinar, and I'm putting both of them together. As you may be able to hear, I'm still not 100%, but I will do my best to make this as engaging as I possibly can under the circumstances. Okay, in case any of you don't know who I am, Gianna, am I? Oh, no, that's right. I have to move the thing up here. There I am. In case any of you don't know me or you want to put a face to the voice, that's who I am, and that's where I can be contacted for anything, for any further things that you may need. I'd like to urge you to look at our website. And take a look, browse around. We have, it is an absolute depth of information if you're interested in cannabis. And we have an extensive array of things that you can, the resources that either inform you or can aid in the treatment of any of your clients. And the number there, the 1800 number, is our lifeline number, is our information and helpline, either for you for information or for your clients who want to take perhaps an anonymous counselling session over the phone. But again, we have so many things available. We have a website or a web-based intervention, and we have one that's self-help, which is the Clear Your Vision that you can see on the right-hand corner. Now, this very brief intervention is based on research and primarily the clinical guidelines that we put together when we first started at NICPIC. Now, there are no more hard copies left to send out, but you can, if you would like, download it off our website as a reference point. And obviously the chapters that are most relevant are the ones on screening, assessment and brief interventions. So the VBI is based on what the research suggests is effective. And again, just to add a few more suggestions, here are some books that you might wish to refer to. Again, it's very hard for me to be able to gauge your experience and how long you've been in the field, but for those who are interested in motivational interviewing and perhaps getting the latest updated version, there's the book there, and of course Treatment Approaches to Alcohol and Drug Dependence, which is based on CBT, is also available. And then the one on the right is a kind of, I guess, how can I call it, a synergy of everything that we know about cannabis, and the second half is about someone who may wish to stop on their own. Again, it's believe it or not, it's not a bad read. So that's the third alternative. Okay, my aim today really is to raise the importance of screening and assessing for cannabis use, obviously, to aid a discussion with the aim of avoiding or perhaps reducing the harms and perhaps reducing dependence. So the other thing is just to introduce you to a kind of framework for a very brief intervention. Some of you may or may not know, we run 3 other workshops that are available to all sectors, throughout Australia and to practitioners. The one I'm going to present today obviously is A, which stands for Screening, Assessment, Feedback and Education. We also have the ACCU, that is a 2, possibly 3-session intervention. Of course, we have the Quitting Cannabis, 1 to 6 sessions for people who are actively seeking treatment. So these are the 3 kind of workshops that we offer. Now, early or brief intervention. The goal really of early or brief intervention is, as I've already said, to prevent harms by informing and hence decreasing the use and acquiring mastery in order for the client not to get any more tolerance to the drug and by that then increasing their use. And possibly hopefully, is to avoid dependence. Okay, now it's helpful to keep in mind these 5 A's. I think that they are a very useful way of thinking through things. So I think it's really important to ask about cannabis use during your standard intake. I think then you assess the various aspects that are pertinent to their use or perhaps problems that are associated with their use. You may then wish to advise or rather educate someone in relation to what they're concerned about or seeing you about in relation and make that association between what they're seeing you about perhaps and their cannabis use. Assist them if that's appropriate, if you think that that's relevant, and to arrange anything for them or follow up if that's requested. So again, I like to use the 5 A's whenever I deliver a workshop. So the 2 main components of an early or a very brief intervention is rapid engagement, and for that the use of MI is really an amazing way to reduce barriers that the person may have, and it increases rapport and engagement. So for those and then, of course, there's detection, but I'll get onto that in a minute. But for those who are not familiar with MI, I just simply want to define motivational interviewing in terms of a layperson's definition is that motivational interviewing is a collaborative conversational style, strengthening a person's own motivation and commitment to change. A practitioner's definition, or at least Bill Miller's definition of motivational interviewing, is that it is person-centered counselling and it addresses the common problem of ambivalence about change. So if you're not familiar with MI, I think it's really a good idea perhaps to kind of brush up on it, because it's very important when you deliver a brief intervention that the client is engaged not only with you but in what you have to say. One suggestion in the MI world is the use of frames. It's a great way to summarise and aid in rapport building and engagement. And I'll just go through what frames stands for. It stands for feedback, responsibility, advice, menu, which is about options or choices, and empathy. Then there is self-efficacy. And just to demonstrate very quickly what you might want to do, and I just want to say that can be done in either 1 minute, or it can be done by expanding it to a 5 or a 6 or even a 10-minute discussion. So the feedback, you'd say, I don't know, let's call him Dave. Dave, what you've told me today is this and that and the other, and what we have gone over is, you told me you smoke this and that you are worried about that, and so on. So you just basically feedback what they've told you. Then you may stress that, look, it's up to you. That's responsibility. It's up to you, Dave, whatever you want to do. I'm just here to be, as useful as I possibly can to you, give you as much information as you need. But at the end of the day, it's entirely up to you what you want to do about this. And then, of course, my suggestion is, or would you be interested in hearing what I have to say? Would you like me to give you, would it be okay if I gave you this pamphlet or sheet or bit of information? So that relates to the advice part. And then menu is about choices. People need to feel that they have choices. And you might say, look, Dave, you can continue to see me, or you can get onto the website, or you can get, self-help stuff or whatever there is, or you can continue to use, and then you go through all the various options of what would happen if they were to use or cut down and so on. And obviously displaying empathy, which I don't have to tell you how to do, but just to reflect some level of empathy. And then, of course, self-efficacy is absolutely critical, that you find something in that person's history of a positive nature to reflect back. And, for example, if Dave had gone through some terrible trauma or something negative, I might say something like, look, you were able to deal with being in hospital for, more than a month. I mean, that would have been extremely difficult. But so, if you're able to do that, which is really hard, you might be able to perhaps, apply the same sort of tenacity or resilience to wanting to make some changes if that's what you want. So that's a kind of a very brief version of what Frames is. Okay, and the other component, of course, is detection. In other words, assessing use and or any problems that are related to use. Okay, let's move on to the very brief intervention. And SAFE stands for Screening, Assessing, Feedback, Educating. Meet Dave, 20-year-old male, started smoking weed at 16 years of age, became a daily smoker at 17, so that was very quick, has 8 cones daily, going the wrong way, spends about $125 a week and loves his daily cones to help him relax, and as most people say, it helps them sleep. So again, the SAFE steps are screening, assessing, feedback, educating, then exploring and expanding in the event that someone is interested in perhaps reducing, cutting down, or even stopping. Okay, so first thing we need to do is to screen. Now, this screener is available as a download from our website, and it is a validated measure of dependence. It's 5 questions, and you probably can't read the bottom, but it gives you the cutoff line. Now, the maximum score is 15, and depending on the age, the cutoff will be either 3 for people who are 19 years or over, or 4 for anyone that's younger. So you might suggest, would it be okay, Dave, for you to just answer a few questions on this SDS? So I'm not sure whether or not cannabis is an issue for you, and I'm just trying to get an idea, of whether it is problematic or not. So would it be okay for you to just answer these 5 questions? Hopefully they can read. If not, you will have to read it for them. So the thing you might need to do before you give him the SDS is to preface it with a question about dependence. So you might say, look, Dave, do you know what I mean by dependence? And it's very, very important that he understands what that is. So if he's unable to answer you, it's very hard for me to ask you guys out there, what you think he might say, so I'm just going to assume. He might say, no, don't know, in which case you might say, well, look, in the drug and alcohol field, we usually measure dependence in 2 ways, generally. We look at tolerance and we look at withdrawal. Do you know what I mean by tolerance? Again, these are questions rather than you giving the statement or just handing the questionnaire over. I think it's really important to kind of couch it in a way that it will be better received. So Then you go ahead and you kind of explain tolerance. You say, Dave, do you know what I mean by tolerance? If he says no, you say, okay, well, how much did you need to smoke when you first started? Like, how much would it take for you to feel really relaxed and, feel a high? And generally speaking, some people will say, oh, I had half a cone or a couple of puffs or half a joint and, it was just amazing and so on. You go, okay, so how much does it take now to get that same feeling? And of course, that person will invariably, if they're smoking daily, will say, well, it takes me at least 2 or 3 or whatever. In which case you then ask, so how do you think that happened? That is trying to, suggest a way in which people understand tolerance. And so you say, well, yeah, the body gets used to everything. Everything we put in our body, the body adapts to it, and so particularly addictive substances. And so, yes, it appears to me that there's a tolerance happening there. And what about withdrawal, Dave? Has there been, a time in the last, 6 months, 12 months, whatever you think is appropriate, where you haven't been able to get any, you haven't had the money, or you haven't found your dealer, you don't know where he is, or you've been away with your parents? He might give you an example. You say, well, how did you feel? Like what was happening for you during that time? And again, he may say, well, I felt ratty, I felt shitty, I couldn't sleep, in which you may confirm that, yeah, well, that sounds like there's a bit of withdrawal going on there. Because what you're saying is, these are kind of very classic symptoms of withdrawal. So by prefacing the SDS, you're more likely to get an honest answer because, he can understand that perhaps there is some tolerance happening, there is some withdrawal, and hopefully he will be able to answer it a bit more truthfully. Now, as far as our Dave is concerned, he answered sometimes to, did you ever think that your use was out of control? Did the prospect of missing the smoke make you anxious or worried? Sometimes. Did you worry about your use of cannabis? Sort of. Did you wish you could stop? Sometimes. And how difficult do you think you could stop or go without? So he answered 2 for that, and he ended up with a score of 7. Now, unless he asks, you don't necessarily need to give him the score because that comes in the feedback. So you just leave it there and thank him for filling that out. The next part is assessing. And really, what we're trying to assess is, a great deal of detail about the pattern of use, which is quantity, frequency, duration. And pattern is, first thing in the morning, all day, at lunchtime, when you come home, what is your pattern? And then assess any problems by using the CPQ. This is Cannabis Problems Questionnaire, and there are 2 of them. The A stands for adolescent. So you, again, may wish to download either or both of these and suggest that, someone fill them out. And again, it needs to be prefaced by, look, some people say that they have problems related to cannabis, and these are some of the problems that other people say that they experience. Can you just tell me whether or not you experience any of these? Again, it is a much softer way to, and encouraging, I think, to get people to answer the problems questionnaire in the most, hopefully, open-minded, kind of honest way. Now, these problems, as I said, need to be assessed. So there's a list of possible problems that are related to use, and most clients will have experienced some of them. So it's unlikely that he'll have nothing on that list. So we've covered screening and assessing, and I hope I've explained that sufficiently in between our interruptions, which again I will apologise. So now we move on to part 2, which is the feedback and the education, and then explore and perhaps expand the intervention if he is willing to do that. So when it comes to feedback, you need to feedback from the screening and from the assessment. And again, this is just a suggested question. Look, would it be okay for me to offer you some feedback now that you've filled out these 2 questionnaires? The SDS and giving feedback. Now, the SDS, you'd say, look, you scored 7 on the SDS. Now, the maximum is 15, and you scored a 7. What do you think that means? How would you interpret that score? 3 or above is dependent, or 4 and above, depending on the age. And you scored is dependent, and you scored 7. So, I don't know, what do you make of that? What do you feel about that? Again, it is absolutely essential that you hear from them rather than you say, look, you've got a moderate amount of dependence, you scored 7 out of 15, that means it's moderate, and so on. So, again, it's done in, hopefully, a motivational, open-ended question type of way where you would feedback from the screener and the assessment. Now, as I said, he's scored all these and you fed back the score. And you may wish to use a normative data that we have that can be downloaded so that you can compare Dave's views to the general population in terms of males, his age. And so you might just want to discuss, repeat the problems that he has written. Okay, you might want to give some health education. Again, I think it's important to ask what he thinks about all that, and I would love Dave, I'd love to hear your views on what you and I have been discussing and what you think about what I've said so far in terms of, the SDS or dependence, the problems questionnaire, feedback, and, what do you think about all that? Or there's another question then, which is, I've been listening to what you've been saying. Look, may I share some thoughts with you? Again, it is asking permission to give information. And the last one is very straightforward, which is, would you like me to give you some written or other information so that you're better informed? And, of course, we have an absolute depth that you can avail yourself either by downloading and printing it off or by ordering it, and we send them to you. We've got booklets, we've got the website, which has got a pretty good search engine, and there's a lot there that people may want to look at, or even yourselves. As I said to you earlier, we've got fact sheets that you can print out. You can tell him about the helpline, you can tell him about the web-based intervention, and you can tell him about the self-help. So, we've screened using the SDS. We've assessed, as I said, pattern, frequency, duration, and so on. We've looked at any possible problems that may, have come out of your discussion with him. You've given him some feedback, and you've educated him by giving him some information and so on. So now you kind of just need to explore and expand. So, in terms of exploring readiness to change, again, I'd love to hear your views on what we've been discussing. Do you have any interest in exploring this a bit further with me? Is there any chance that you would like to explore this a bit more? And, how do you feel about, looking at this in a bit more depth with me? So there are some possible suggestions. Again, you might say, do you think it would take, what do you think it would take for your symptoms to improve? Whatever you think clinically is appropriate in relation to that question. Or what would things be like for you in the future if those symptoms stay the same? Would you like to make a change in relation to your cough or your health or whatever? And if so, how would you go about making that change? Now, to make it a little bit more concrete, you might want to administer the interest ruler, and this is what it looks like. It's really just a gauge on a score of 1 to 10, and you might invite Dave to say, look, tell me, can you just circle for me on a scale of 1 to 10 how interested that you might be in changing your cannabis use? Now, as far as Dave is concerned, there's a 4. Now, you might say, okay, so why aren't you a 2? How come you're a 4? So you should always look at a lesser number. It's not like he's got 0 interest or, something that's 2 or 3. He's got 4. So how come you're not at 1 or 2? How come you are a 4? So it's very important to hear his point of view and where he's coming from. And these are some questions that you might wish to ask. So why are you interested or not interested in making a change? Always questions. I think they are an incredibly powerful tool because we're so used to telling rather than asking. So what would make you, as I said, move from X to Y, or from 2 to 4, or from 4 to 6? And if you're interested in change, what would that look like? What are the things that you might take into account in making those changes? Now, if the client is not interested at all, doesn't want to talk about it, not interested in discussing this with you at all, it's a very, very important question that you need to ask about the future. What would indicate, that you were smoking too much? So tell me, how would you know? It's the how would you know question. That's fine, Dave, I respect your decision, you're not interested. But in the future, tell me, how would you know that you were smoking too much? And again, you need to hear what, markers there are for him. Explain that it's important for him, to discuss how he could clearly identify when his use became unacceptable or harmful or excessive for him. So you need to push for details. So the how would you know question, or how do you know, helps that young person recognise, as I said, and focus on signs that they're, of overuse as they see them. So get the specific description of the signs, explore each of the signs and reflect that back. Provide a summary, you might want to use a little bit of frames, of overuse and ask if that's accurate. Ask, whether they have plans to change, and if so, how might they go about it. Support their self-efficacy in change. Again, as I said, you might say something like, look, you managed to give up whatever, cigarettes, or I don't know, something that you know about them, which is great. And a lot of people find, that really hard to do, but you've shown that you can do it and you can make some tough changes. So you may probably be able to reduce your cannabis use if that's really what you wanted to do. So again, it does help the person recognise and focus on the signs of their overuse, and hopefully makes explicit motivators for changing, in the future. Again, it's not a guarantee. It's absolutely not a guarantee, but maybe something will resonate. Maybe you've sown a seed, and maybe that person, again, depending on the level of use and how problematic it is, may think, oh, shit, I said I'd stop or look at this when I don't know, flunked out of school or got kicked out of home or whatever it happens to be. So work with that person to put together the information that they give to inform you, and give a specific description and signs that they told you about where they thought they may be smoking too much. Okay, I think I've explained that well enough. So push for concrete examples. How often is too often? How much is too much money? How much will your grades fall by? What level is acceptable? What would the consequences of that look like? And again, put together specific examples of signs of what is too much and feed that back. Then offer some harm minimisation. And these are some that you might suggest. Maybe make sure that you don't increase your use. And in order to do that, you might think about reducing by a third, which means that you won't experience withdrawal, but at least it will reduce your consumption. And hopefully, if you can maintain that, then, you won't need to increase your use. So you have to kind of set some rules around that, like, only use when you come home at night, or only use after lunch, or whatever. And as I said, in order to maintain and not increase, you might want to think about reducing your use by a third for a week. And just as an example, if someone smokes, I don't know, hard to say without knowing your clients, but so if he smokes 9 a day, he might want to reduce that by a third for a week, so down to 6, and then another third for another week, and until it's at an acceptable level for him. Now, what is really, there's another way is to cut down the number of days, but what is really important is to educate that person that they should not inhale deeply and hold on to that smoke. They're not going to get a higher high. So what they should do is smoke it like a cigarette and take 4 small puffs, because the damage is worsened by the deep inhalation and the holding on to the smoke into your lungs. So again, that's another suggestion to minimize the harms. Smoke joints, not bongs. If you can, maybe use glass that's totally clean. If you are reducing, think about the relationship between, and they mull up with tobacco, you need to discuss the relationship between tobacco and cannabis. And the two have this kind of, synergy where both together is worse than each one of them individually when they're smoked. So you might want to talk about perhaps getting some patches if they were to reduce, because you do not want that person to go into withdrawal. That's the last thing you need, is for them to feel discomfort. So you might want to just tell them a little bit more about that. And again, another way is to mull up with less cannabis or less tobacco in order to reduce the harms. Now, if a person's not sure, look, I'm not sure, I don't know if I'm ready, you might suggest, here are some few options or issues that I can see. Would it be helpful to talk about some of these things, in order that you may consider them? And then you might go through the consequences. What would happen if there was no change, stopping, reduction, and so on. And then revisit, look, are any of these options interesting to you? Is there anything that you'd like to know in order to kind of decide, I want to cut down, or no, I'm happy doing what I'm doing. So I think it's very important to explore that with them. So that is when someone is unsure. Okay, now if there is, a yes, there is some level of interest in discussing this a bit further with you, then it's the how do you know you're smoking too much? Because during this entire conversation, this should never be seen as counselling. This should never be seen as you trying to get them to reduce. This is only, I just need to know a little bit about your cannabis use, because I'm not sure whether or not it has any effect on what you're seeing me about, and so I just need to explore this a bit more. So there's never any suggestion that that needs to stop, or that this is counselling in any way. So the key message really is to, allay fears that this is what you're trying to do, and so on. So getting back to, yes, I might be interested, even if it's a 4. So how do you know that you're smoking too much? And get specific descriptions, as it's written up there, of signs, and provide a brief summary of overuse and ask if it's accurate. So ask, given that you plan to make some change, how might you go about this? Support self-efficacy again. And as I said earlier, you've made some tough decisions, so on. I think you could change your cannabis use if you wanted to. So what do you think? What do you reckon? Okay. So that is the how do you know you are smoking too much. So the first one is how would you know if you get a no answer? If you get, look, I'm not sure, you need to, I guess, unearth that a bit more by asking some questions. Well, what information can I give you to kind of decide whether you want to have a go or whether you want to continue? And if you get a yes, then this is the how do you know you're smoking too much? Because you never ever said that they were smoking too much. So you need, as I said, to get them to answer that, because I think it's important to highlight that whenever you ask a person a question, it actually forces them to think about something in order to give an answer. And that is why the use of questions is a powerful thing. It really does shift the focus from you having to do all the work onto them having to really think about what you're asking them. So, as I said, when you get a look, maybe I should have a go at this, depending on how the discussions gone so far, you need to allay fears. You need to clarify the problems or concerns that they have and allay any fears around that. Again, as I said, give them correct and accurate information and give them choices in relation to any change or any intervention. People want to feel that they are in control because change does come from within a person. So all that being fantastic and good, you may then go on to, if you think it's appropriate, and it's entirely up to your, clinical feel for, where to go from here and how receptive Dave may be to this. So if you deem this appropriate, you need to ask, okay, so tell me, how important is it for you to make this change? And again, let's just use Dave. He may answer a 4, in which case, you may ask these appropriate questions. What would need to happen? Again, if you want to, you can go, okay, so why are you a 4 and not a 2? And hear what he has to say, and then you might say, okay, so what would need to happen for it to become more important for you to change, say a 6 or a 7? And what's stopping you from moving in that direction? And if you were to change, what would that look like? Is there anything that I or anyone else can do to kind of help you or support you? So what are the things that you might take into account that gives you a score of 4, for example? So again, all that being good, you will ask about importance. That was important said. About confidence. And so again, Dave, can you circle for me how confident you are in your ability to kind of change your cannabis use? And scored himself a 5. And what would it take to make you more confident about making these changes? And what would happen, to take your score from a this to a that? And how can I or anyone else, help you to make these changes? You might ask about previous attempts and see what's, helped or what hasn't helped. And I guess, what steps need to be achieved in order to achieve his goal. Now, it is advisable that you give clients choices. Again, stop, cut down, whatever, and discuss the various referral options. As I said, this is part of frames. This is the menu. These are the choices. Come back to see you, see his GP, whatever. Give people advice, but again, it needs to be stressed that you need to ask permission to give that advice. Would it be okay for me to tell you this, or would it be okay for me to share some of this information? Would it be all right, to give you this pamphlet? So that's the advice. I mean, and the most important advice is, any use is risky and does have long-term problems and so on. Empathy, obviously, again, I don't have to stress that, which is part and parcel of what you do every day. Warmth, reflective, understanding manner, and so on. It's been found to be more effective than anything else. And then self-efficacy. Check to see, if they think they have the ability to make that change, and look for examples where they've been able to make positive changes in their life before. And if they don't think that they can make the change, you need to ask, well, why don't you think you can make that change? And then raise the notion of review or referring on if you think that that's appropriate. A brief summary of the VBI, which can be delivered depending on where you are and your situation and what that client's seeing you about, can be really delivered, in 10-15 minutes, but ideally in a 30-minute discussion. So you need to screen, and of course you use the ACS for that. You need to assess, as I said, quantity, frequency, duration, pattern, and problematic use using the CPQ. Give the feedback, what do you think about that? What do you think about what we've covered so far? You scored this, what do you think that means? Educate, of course, and after the safe delivery, after you've screened, assessed, fed back and educated, you might then explore readiness to change using the rulers, depending on, whether they answer yes, no, or I'm not sure. And then, of course, expand if they say yes, or refer on, as I said, website, whoever, depending on what the situation is. And of course, I'm stabbing in the dark here, not knowing where you're from and who you work with and so on. So, okay, hopefully it all has a happy ending. I'm absolutely happy to field any questions if I haven't been clear or succinct. So take-home message, you must ask, do you smoke dope? Use whatever word they use for cannabis. Assess, as we've already discussed. Advise with permission. Assist if they're willing. And arrange if they're willing. And before I go, I just want to draw your attention to one of Nick Pick's music competition winners. I would, urge you to see this great clip, and perhaps, if it's appropriate, share this with some of your clients if you think that it is appropriate to look at or discuss. But, I'd urge you to look at it and see if there's any place where you might be able to use it. Again, I don't know, you may work in groups or whatever. So, enjoy the song, or it's a great song from our music competition. Okay, now we're coming to an end, and I do want to make sure I've got time for some questions. If you have any further requests for a workshop, or for us to come to you to give a more in-depth workshop and so on, 2 hours or 4 hours or whatever it is that you need, and I explain the 3 different types of workshops that we offer, and what each of those intervention relates to. The first one, which is a 30-minute one, the second one, which is the ACCU, and oh, by the way, if you don't want to see me, but you do want to hear about the ACCU and the Quitting Cannabis, I have done webinars. I think I did the ACCU last year, and I think I did the Quitting Cannabis the year before, or maybe vice versa. But they are available, again, via webinar. They did take, a couple of hours. So, that is more detailed. And so that is, again, a choice that people have rather than attending a workshop, if you want to know anything about the other 2 interventions. The ACCU is about ambivalent clients, and of course the Quitting Cannabis is about people who are ready for treatment and are in the action stage. So I just want to thank you very much for attending this webinar series, and I really am sorry I didn't have the energy to give it a good go, but I hope you'll forgive me. I did try. So I will now hand over to Kate to see if there have been any questions that I'm more than happy to answer for you. So over to you, Miss Kate.
Thank you, Effie, and that was a great presentation.
Oh, thanks.
There is a question. So a couple of people were wondering if a client says to you, well, have you ever had a joint? How can you talk to me about, this? How would you tackle such a question from a client?
Well, I would have to say, look, I don't have to have experienced something to know about it. And I used to run relapse prevention courses in a detox, and I used to be asked that question quite often. And I would simply reply, look, you don't necessarily have to be a woman to be able to give or to deliver a baby or to be a gynecologist. So just because I haven't used cannabis doesn't mean I cannot relate to, the problems that you might have, or, your ability to use cannabis to cope. And, there are human characteristics that bind us all together, and I do understand where you're coming from. And it's not like I have never experienced pain or rejection, or perhaps not to the same extent as you have, but believe me, I do understand. That is what empathy is, and this is why I do this job, because I care about other people and really want to help. So I don't necessarily have to have been a cannabis user myself. So that's the way I might answer it.
Great.
Anything else?
That was it, Essie.
No questions. Oh my God.
Yeah, just a couple. Yeah, just that one question. If anyone does have any questions that they may think to ask Essie later on, feel free to email Essie at essie@unsw.edu.au for any further information on this intervention or the other interventions that the clinical training team offer.
I hope that it has been, useful. It is, again, something else in your toolbox that you might use